It started with a leak. Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General, wasn't looking for trouble. She had been quietly building a legal team focused on government accountability, staying mostly out of the media spotlight. That changed when an anonymous envelope arrived at her private legal office in Tampa. No return address. No note. Just a single USB drive inside a plain white envelope marked only with the word, classified. Bondi hesitated for a moment, then plugged the drive into an air-gapped laptop. What she found made her stop breathing. There were emails, hundreds of them, between top White House aides, undisclosed financial transfers, and confidential calendar logs. But it wasn't the volume of information that shocked her. It was who was at the center of it all, Kamala Harris and Jill Biden. The documents hinted at back-channel meetings with private contractors, unreported security decisions, and what appeared to be coordinated efforts to bypass internal ethics reviews. And most damningly, a list of names, whistleblowers, lobbyists, and legal staffers, marked, handle quietly. Bondi's instincts kicked in. This wasn't just political maneuvering. This could be federal. Without hesitation, she called her most trusted investigator. "We've got a live one," she said, voice cold and calm. "And it's going straight to Congress." The fuse had been lit. Word traveled fast in Washington, especially when the name Pam Bondi was attached to it. By the time her team touched down in D.C. the next morning, the air around Capitol Hill was already buzzing. Staffers traded hushed conversations in elevators, avoiding eye contact. A few senior aides from both parties quietly asked for off-the-record meetings. Something was brewing, and everyone felt it. Bondi wasn't playing games. She arrived at the Capitol flanked by two former federal prosecutors and a cybersecurity analyst who had already verified the authenticity of the files. Her team walked straight into the office of the House Oversight Committee chair and requested a closed-door session. Within hours, she was sitting across from a dozen lawmakers, dropping the first bombshell. "This isn't about politics," she began, her tone razor-sharp. "This is about trust, and what happens when people in power believe they're untouchable." She projected the internal memos onto a secure screen. One, allegedly signed off by a Harris staffer, approved a confidential operations budget sourced from a foundation with close ties to a foreign lobbying group. Another email from Jill Biden's office included coded language about alternative scheduling for meetings with private defense contractors, held off White House grounds. Gasps echoed around the room. "This is bigger than Watergate," one congressman muttered under his breath. Bondi leaned forward. "And that's just the first folder." Outside, reporters swarmed the building. Cameras rolled. But inside, behind locked doors, a political earthquake was gathering force. And the White House had no idea what was about to hit them. When the White House got wind of Bondi's closed-door meeting with the Oversight Committee, alarm bells went off, fast. Chief of Staff Jeff Zients called an emergency briefing. Kamala Harris's legal counsel was pulled from a scheduled conference in Brussels. Jill Biden canceled a charity appearance mid-transit. The press hadn't broken the story yet, but insiders knew the window to contain it was shrinking by the hour. In a private Situation Room meeting, Vice President Harris sat stone-faced as folders marked, "Bondi dossier," were dropped in front of her. She flipped through the pages, her jaw tightening. "This is an orchestrated smear campaign," she said flatly. "We've seen this playbook before." But the documents didn't feel like political sabotage. They were too detailed. Too real. Meanwhile, Jill Biden was in a separate room with her own legal advisors. Her face was pale as she read a transcript of an internal conversation between one of her aides and a now-deceased Department of Defense consultant. The notes suggested secret meetings she couldn't publicly deny without contradicting previously released schedules. One advisor whispered nervously, "If Bondi has recordings, this could get ugly." Outside the White House, media trucks were already lining Pennsylvania Avenue. A senior CNN correspondent tweeted, "Breaking, Sources confirm Pam Bondi delivered confidential files to Congress implicating top White House officials. Developing. The floodgates were creaking. Inside, a chilling question loomed: what else does Pam Bondi have? And more importantly, who was helping her? While the White House scrambled behind closed doors, Pam Bondi was already 10 steps ahead. Her next move? A calculated leak, not to the press, but to someone far more dangerous to the administration, Senator Byron Donalds. Donalds had been waiting for a moment like this. Known for his aggressive questioning and no-nonsense style, he was one of the few lawmakers willing to challenge the White House head-on, and Bondi knew he had the platform to make the story explode without breaking a single law. They met in a private lounge near the Capitol after hours. No cameras. No staff. Bondi handed him a tablet with a single folder titled Harris-Biden Index. Donald scrolled through it in silence. After 5 minutes, he looked up with a slow, stunned expression. "This is real?" he asked, voice low. "Authenticated. Triple-checked. If I go public, they'll spin it. If you do it in a committee hearing, they won't be able to stop it," he finished for her. The next morning, during a high-profile oversight hearing on federal transparency, Donald struck. "I'd like to enter new evidence into the record," he announced casually. "It pertains to unreported financial transfers and covert meetings involving senior White House officials, including Vice President Harris and the First Lady." The room froze. Cameras zoomed in. Even the opposing party didn't interrupt. He laid out the documents with precision, no accusations, just data. Dates. Signatures. Routes of money. Unexplained line items. Then he dropped the question: are we looking at a breach of federal ethics, or something much worse? The headlines were immediate. Pam Bondi stayed quiet, for now. Because this wasn't just about exposure. It was about who would fall first. The White House went into full crisis mode. By midday, national headlines screamed, "Whistleblower files shake White House, Harris Jill Biden under congressional fire, Donalds drops bombshell evidence live, Bondi behind it all." Inside the press room, Karine Jean-Pierre stood stiffly before a wall of cameras, fielding a barrage of hostile questions. "The Vice President and First Lady categorically deny any wrongdoing," she said firmly. "These so-called documents are being manipulated to create a false narrative during an election season." But behind the scenes, panic ruled. The internal communications team was instructed to scrub all staff calendars from the last 18 months. White House attorneys were dispatched to review Jill Biden's private travel records. And someone from the Harris camp quietly reached out to a trusted reporter, trying to spin the story before Bondi revealed even more. Meanwhile, Bondi herself was watching everything unfold from a secure hotel suite in Georgetown, surrounded by digital security experts and retired intelligence officers. She wasn't smiling, this wasn't a game. She turned to her team and said, "They're betting I'll fold under pressure. They don't understand, I haven't even released the classified portions." Then her phone buzzed. A senior Republican strategist had just texted, "We need to talk. Bondi 2028. She ignored it. That wasn't the mission. That night, Senator Byron Donalds appeared on primetime news. Calm. Calculated. Lethal. "We're not accusing. We're investigating. But let me be clear," he said into the camera, "if even half of what we've seen is true, this could redefine political corruption at the highest levels." Pam Bondi watched in silence. Tomorrow, the recordings would be released. And no one at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue was sleeping easy. At exactly 9 a.m. the next morning, Bondi's team executed a meticulously planned release. A secured congressional subdomain published 3 redacted audio files, all verified, all time-stamped, featuring conversations between senior aides from Kamala Harris's office and 2 now-defunct consulting firms. The subject? How to quietly reroute federal grant money through non-trackable civic partners. The voices were clear. The intent was unmistakable. In one clip, a male aide was heard saying, "We'll run it through the foundation." No direct link to the VP. "We've done this before." The second clip? Even more explosive. A voice alleged to be from Jill Biden's inner circle discussed holding side meetings with defense donors during a state education event. No cameras. Just a dinner. The First Lady talks values, they talk numbers. That's how it works. Social media went into meltdown. Hashtag Bondi Files, hashtag Harris Leak, and hashtag Jill Exposed trended across platforms. Mainstream networks scrambled to verify, but Bondi's press team had already beaten them to the punch. A public dashboard was launched with metadata logs, verification reports, and even testimony from a whistleblower paralegal who had helped organize one of the covert meetings. Meanwhile, Vice President Harris canceled her scheduled keynote address at a climate summit. Jill Biden's spokesperson issued a vague statement about selective editing and political theater. But no one was buying it. Back at the Capitol, Bondi met privately with two Senate committee leaders. What she said was brief and terrifying. There's a fourth recording. It hasn't been made public yet. It directly implicates foreign influence. If that gets out, it won't just be headlines. It'll be subpoenas. The mood shifted. This wasn't just scandal anymore. It was national security. And the countdown to full-blown crisis had begun. By now, every major news outlet had assigned full-time investigative teams to the Bondi files. But no one had the fourth recording. That was by design. Pam Bondi sat down in a secure conference room with two powerful figures, the Senate Intelligence Committee chair and a veteran federal prosecutor who had taken down multiple corruption cases. She handed them a single encrypted drive. "I'm not leaking this," she said. "You need to handle it through proper channels. Because if the public hears this raw, it could trigger something we can't control." The chair inserted the drive. The audio began. It was crystal clear. An aide, believed to be connected to Kamala Harris's foreign policy advisory team, was heard discussing a private video call with a foreign NGO leader with links to a nation currently under U.S. sanctions. What started as vague diplomatic outreach escalated into something damning. "We've got the support," the voice said. "All we need is soft access, through the First Lady's channels. She opens the door. You move in. Just keep it off official logs." Another voice responded, "So long as there's plausible deniability on both ends. If this goes sideways, we were never here." The room fell silent. The prosecutor looked at Bondi. This crosses every line. This isn't just corruption. It's a national breach." Bondi nodded. "Now you see why I didn't release it." Back at the White House, damage control was imploding. Internal leaks confirmed that both Harris and Jill Biden had retained private legal counsel. A known fixer who previously worked with Clinton-era scandals was reportedly flown in overnight. That evening, Bondi held a brief press conference, her first since the scandal began. "I have turned over the final piece of evidence to federal authorities. It is now in their hands. The American people deserve truth. No one is above the law, not even those in the West Wing." Reporters shouted questions. She said nothing more. But one thing was certain, the storm wasn't coming. It was already here. The following morning, the White House looked like a fortress under siege. Secret Service presence was visibly ramped up. Staffers avoided eye contact as they walked the halls. Inside the Situation Room, President Biden was briefed directly, not just on the scandal, but on the implications of the fourth recording now in federal hands. "This isn't a political crisis anymore," the NSA director warned. "This is an exposure threat." Kamala Harris and Jill Biden were both advised to prepare sworn statements. But internally, the vice president was furious. "They want a fall person," she snapped at her chief of staff. "They want me to fall on the sword for something bigger. I won't be the scapegoat." Meanwhile, a rumor began to swirl, that Bondi was set to testify publicly before a special Senate hearing. Social media lit up. Outside the Capitol, protesters gathered on both sides. Some demanded resignations. Others carried signs reading, "Truth, Power," and "Pam Bondi for DOJ." Pam stayed silent. But Byron Donalds didn't. Appearing again on cable news, he leaned into the moment. "You can't call this a conspiracy when every document checks out. You can't call this a witch hunt when your own aides are flipping." Then he dropped a grenade. "We've just received word, one former White House advisor is ready to testify. Under oath. And they're naming names." That night, another leak emerged, this one from a federal court source. An emergency sealed subpoena had been issued. The target? A former Harris policy advisor suspected of facilitating communications with the foreign NGO. As for Jill Biden, an insider close to the First Lady described her as visibly shaken, uncertain whether to fight or step back quietly. Back at Bondi's hotel suite, she received a secure message from a trusted contact on the Hill. "They're discussing invoking the 25th if this escalates." Pam exhaled slowly. The fallout had only just begun. The next 24 hours sent shockwaves through the nation. At 11:47 a.m., an exclusive report from a major investigative outlet confirmed what insiders had feared: a former top aide to Kamala Harris had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators. His name, Julian Keyes, a quiet, meticulous policy advisor who had worked closely with Harris during her Senate days and then transitioned with her into the White House. Few people outside the inner circle even knew his name. But Bondi did. He was the linchpin. In a closed-door deposition that lasted over 6 hours, Julian laid out the timeline, how unofficial meetings were orchestrated, how messaging apps were wiped, and most damningly, how certain staffers were instructed to use burner phones for off-the-record communications tied to non-profit shell groups. One line from his testimony leaked almost instantly: "Everything we did was under orders." It came from the top. "We were told if anyone asked, deny or redirect." Bondi's team remained composed. This wasn't a victory lap, it was confirmation that the iceberg was even bigger than they thought. Senator Byron Donalds immediately called for a bipartisan investigatory commission, stating, "If we don't act now, then when? If this isn't the line, what is?" That evening, Jill Biden canceled all remaining public events indefinitely. Her spokesperson claimed it was for personal family reasons. But insiders knew better. At the same time, photos emerged of Harris's legal team entering the Department of Justice building, flanked by security, walking briskly, no comments given. Cable news anchors were openly speculating now: would resignations follow? Could Harris be removed? And would Jill Biden face charges, or retreat into private life quietly? Meanwhile, Bondi sat alone in a private chamber, reviewing a draft of her prepared Senate testimony. There was one final revelation she hadn't yet shared. Not with the press. Not even with Donalds. But it was in the file marked, "Executive Complicity, Verified." And once it hit the chamber floor, everything would detonate. The Senate chamber was electric. Reporters filled every available space in the gallery. Millions watched live as Pam Bondi, calm, composed, and armed with a black folder labeled "Verified Evidence, Level 5, took her seat before the special investigative panel. The room fell silent as the committee chair leaned in. "Ms. Bondi, you've already submitted recordings, financial logs, and sworn testimony from a key witness. You've stated you have one final document that ties it all together. Is that correct?" Bondi nodded. "Yes, Mr. Chairman. I have what I believe to be irrefutable evidence of executive-level knowledge." She opened the folder and slid a printed email across the table. The camera zoomed in. It was a correspondence between a high-level White House counsel and an aide to Kamala Harris, referencing direct briefings on the rerouting of federal funds and back-channel meetings involving Jill Biden's office. The most shocking part? The CC field. It included a private email linked to President Biden's executive assistant, with timestamps showing that the message had not only been received, but marked as read. The chamber gasped. Bondi continued, her voice steady but sharp. This email confirms that the financial transfers, shell organizations, and unreported foreign contacts were not just tolerated, they were reviewed and acknowledged at the highest level of the executive branch. The room exploded into murmurs. One senator whispered to another, "This just became a constitutional issue." Bondi didn't stop. She laid out a timeline, showing how these decisions coincided with key policy shifts, suggesting that not only were Harris and Jill Biden involved, but their actions may have influenced official positions taken by the administration on international aid and defense contracts. Across the country, headlines broke within seconds. Bondi connects scandal directly to Oval Office. Bombshell email confirms awareness at the top. Presidential assistant named in corruption timeline. House leaders demand emergency meeting. Inside the White House, all movement halted. The president's closest advisors were summoned to the Roosevelt Room. Phones were confiscated. Legal counsel instructed everyone to remain silent. Back in the Senate, Bondi gave one final statement: "No one relishes exposing corruption at this level. But this is not about partisanship, it's about accountability. And if we don't act now, then the precedent we set will haunt this institution forever." The chairperson banged the gavel. A formal investigation into executive complicity was now active. And in that moment, the balance of power in Washington, D.C. shifted. Permanently. It didn't take long for the tremors to become an earthquake. Within 72 hours of Pam Bondi's testimony, the political landscape in Washington was unrecognizable. A bipartisan coalition in the House fast-tracked a resolution to open an official inquiry into potential misuse of executive power. The Speaker, under immense public pressure, authorized a rare emergency session to determine the scope of the probe. Behind closed doors, both Democratic and Republican leaders agreed, someone had to go. The White House released a statement late at night, hoping to bury it in the news cycle. The president was not personally aware of any misconduct and remains committed to full cooperation with ongoing reviews. Any implication otherwise is categorically false. But the damage was done. Kamala Harris, once seen as untouchable, was now surrounded by attorneys and whisper campaigns. Multiple staffers had already lawyered up. One was rumored to be negotiating full immunity in exchange for deeper details on how foreign actors were funneled into White House-adjacent nonprofits. As for Jill Biden, a close family friend confirmed she was preparing to step away from public life indefinitely. And President Biden? He was said to be furious, not just at Bondi, but at those around him who had failed to contain the growing inferno. Privately, aides whispered he was considering whether stepping down at the end of his term was preferable to facing another political scandal that could stain his legacy forever. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi returned to Florida quietly, avoiding the press. But her name was now everywhere. From Senate chambers to late-night news, the message was clear: she had done what few thought possible, pulled the thread that unraveled the illusion of untouchability. Byron Donalds, now a leading face in the investigation, summed it up perfectly during an evening interview: this was never about revenge. It was about truth. The American people were being played, and someone finally said, enough. In the end, no arrests were made. But careers were ended. Reputations destroyed. The illusion of clean politics at the top shattered beyond repair. And in living rooms across the country, Americans were left asking the one question no administration ever wants to hear: if they could hide this, what else don't we know? Weeks passed, but the chaos didn't fade, it intensified. The Department of Justice, under extreme pressure, announced the formation of a special counsel to investigate the full scope of what had now been dubbed the Harris-Biden shadow operation. The phrase dominated headlines, late-night shows, and every political podcast in America. Meanwhile, the fourth recording, the one involving the foreign NGO, was quietly handed over to the FBI. Investigators confirmed ties between that group and two blacklisted entities flagged in prior intelligence reports. The implication? The back channel wasn't just unethical. It may have skirted national security red lines. Behind the scenes, deals were being struck. At least 3 former staffers flipped, providing new testimony and evidence that broadened the investigation beyond the vice president and first lady. Bondi had always said the corruption ran deeper. Now, the feds were digging into a vast network of shell charities, strategic donations, and diplomatic favors, all carefully hidden beneath layers of legal gray areas. And then came the moment that shifted the tone of the entire nation. Kamala Harris was subpoenaed. Jill Biden formally stepped down from all public duties. And Congress passed a sweeping ethics reform bill, inspired by the scandal, in record time. But not everyone saw it as a victory. At her final press conference, Bondi stood before a packed room. Her voice was even. Her expression, unreadable. This wasn't about political gain. This was about reminding America that no title makes you immune. Power doesn't protect you from accountability. The system works, but only if people are brave enough to challenge it. She didn't take questions. She didn't need to. Because in the end, this story wasn't just about emails, recordings, or hidden meetings. It was about truth, and how one woman's refusal to stay silent forced the entire nation to listen. As she walked away from the podium, the country stood divided, but more awake than it had been in decades. And in the smoky backrooms of Washington, the message was heard loud and clear: the rules had changed.